Unit 11, Post-War America, 1920s Harlem Renaissance, OHS History Team. Learning objectives. Analyze the impact of the Great Migration of African Americans to the industrial regions of the Northeast and Midwest. Describe the Harlem Renaissance impact and people. Examine the racial tensions during this era. Big concepts. At the beginning of the 20th century, 6 million African Americans began to migrate from the South to the North. World War I created many new job opportunities for African Americans. Hoping to escape the violent racism in the South, many African Americans would encounter similar racism in northern cities. African Americans created their own communities in northern and western cities. One such community was in the Harlem neighborhood of New York City. This led to a renaissance of ideas, writing, and music by African Americans who lived and visited there. The Great Migration was a relocation of more than 6 million African Americans from the rural South to the cities of the North, Midwest, and West. Driven from their homes by unsatisfactory economic opportunities and harsh segregationist laws, they took advantage of the need for industrial workers that first arose during the First World War. This is connected back to some big class concepts. We talked about the end of Reconstruction in 1877, Southern states instituting Jim Crow laws, the Supreme Court ruling segregation was legal in Plessy versus Ferguson. Let's fast forward to Woodrow Wilson in 1917, asking Congress for a declaration of war against Germany, the ensuing draft, and the need for workers in northern industrialized cities, which is connected to our industrialization theme back when we talked about the Gilded Age. Many African Americans, when they arrive in northern cities, face similar racism and segregation that they faced in their southern communities. The most important development from this was that African Americans settled in their own neighborhoods. And the most important neighborhood that is created by the Great Migration is in Harlem. It's a development of the Harlem neighborhood in New York City as an African American cultural center. Social and artistic explosion resulted because of the gathering of African Americans from many different backgrounds and educational. From 1910s through the mid-1930s, this neighborhood blossoms. It's a golden age in African American culture, and we'll see it in literature, music, stage performance, and art. As for music, American trumpeter, composer, and vocalist, and actor, we have Louis Armstrong, one of the most influential figures in jazz. Jazz is a music genre that originated in African American communities. It's a blend of many different forms of music, ragtime, marches, blues, and other kinds of music. Duke Ellington, an originator of big band jazz. Duke Ellington was an American composer, pianist, and band leader. He composed thousands of scores over his 50-year career. Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes was a central figure in the Harlem Renaissance. He was a poet and writer, a visionary. He sought to honestly portray the joys and hardships of working class African American lives. He also helped pioneer something called jazz poetry. Zora Neale Hurston, another very famous American folklorist and writer who was associated with the Harlem Renaissance. She is very much celebrated for writing about African American culture in the rural South. She wrote Their Eyes Were Watching God is her most famous book. Racial tensions. The Great Migration causes increased racial tensions between white and black Americans. Many African American communities were attacked or destroyed. The most infamous of these is the Tulsa Race Riot, in which an entire community was burned and destroyed by their white neighbors. Hangings and lynchings continued into the 1920s and beyond as a way to terrorize members of African American communities. We have the persistence of racial violence in the United States, which is one of our other ongoing themes of our American history course. Ida B. Wells. She was another one of our famous civil rights activists. We can add her to the others that we've learned about so far in class, Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. Ida B. Wells led a crusade to inform the public about lynchings and how lynchings were used to terrorize African Americans and to murder African Americans. Marcus Garvey. He was a Jamaican activist who settled in Harlem. He promoted a separatist philosophy. So he promoted the separation of races in the United States, along social, political, and economic freedom for African Americans, known as Garveyism. He spoke of having pride in African history and culture. His ideas were controversial, based on supporting racial segregation. He also had the idea of having African Americans return to Africa. So he started a Back to Africa movement. The NAACP, we've talked about that in class quite a bit when we were talking about W.E.B. Du Bois. It's founded in 1909. The NAACP is the nation's oldest civil rights organization. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, the association led the black civil rights struggle to fight injustices, dedicated to the goal of integrating society. So they didn't want a segregated society like Marcus Garvey. They led anti-lynching campaigns and marches, and they disagreed with Marcus Garvey's separatism philosophy. Here's our timeline. 1916, the Great Migration for war jobs in the North. Remember, the United States is supplying war materials to our allies, England, France, and then Russia before they collapsed to the Bolshevik Revolution. 1922, Ida B. Wells writes about race riots. In 1923, the famous jazz nightclub, the Cotton Club, opens in Harlem. That's where a lot of famous African American musicians would perform. 1925 is the peak of the Harlem Renaissance. 1926, Langston Hughes publishes The Weary Blues. And in 1929, the Great Depression begins.